In a world where medals represent more than metal and ribbon, where they carry the weight of blood, sacrifice, and honor earned in the darkest corners of combat, one woman stood face to face with a general who believed rank trumped everything. He reached for her chest, expecting compliance, expecting submission. What he got instead was a lesson in respect that would echo through military corridors for years to come. This is the story of Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose quiet exterior concealed the deadliest training the military had to offer, and the day she taught a general that some things are sacred, untouchable, and earned through fire that most will never face. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Fort Braxton as Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez adjusted her dress blues one final time. The fabric felt foreign against her skin after months of combat fatigues, but today demanded perfection. Today, she would receive the Silver Star, the nation's third highest military decoration for valor in combat. The weight of what that medal represented pressed against her chest even before it was pinned there. Elena stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark hair pulled into a regulation bun, and brown eyes that seemed to hold depths most people never noticed. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another soldier among many, perhaps a supply clerk or administrative specialist. The carefully cultivated appearance of normalcy was exactly what had made her so effective in the field. Her enemies never saw her coming because they never took her seriously. The ceremony was set to take place in the base's main auditorium, a cavernous space that could hold nearly 1,000 people. Family members, fellow soldiers, and military brass from across the region had gathered to witness the presentation of various awards and commendations. Elena's parents had flown in from New Mexico, her father still wearing his own military ribbons from Vietnam, her mother clutching a tissue that she'd already used several times that morning. As Elena made her way through the backstage area, she caught glimpses of other award recipients preparing for their moment of recognition. There was Specialist Johnson, barely 19, receiving a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in an IED attack. Staff Sergeant Williams was getting a commendation medal for his work training local forces. Each story represented sacrifice, dedication, and service beyond the call of duty. The citation for Elena's Silver Star was classified in its details, but the public version spoke of extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy of the United States. What it didn't mention was the 3-day extraction mission in hostile territory, the 7 enemy combatants she'd eliminated with surgical precision, or the fact that she'd carried a wounded teammate 12 miles through mountain terrain while under fire. Brigadier General Marcus Thornfield had arrived that morning with his usual entourage of staff officers and aides. At 62, Thornfield was a career military man who'd climbed the ranks through a combination of political savvy and strategic positioning rather than combat leadership. His chest was adorned with ribbons and badges that spoke more of administrative achievements than battlefield valor. He had a reputation for being demanding, particular about protocol, and utterly convinced of his own importance. Elena had encountered Thornfield once before, during a briefing at headquarters 6 months earlier. She'd been one of several specialists called in to provide intelligence for an upcoming operation. Thornfield had barely acknowledged her presence, his attention focused entirely on the male officers in the room. When she'd offered a crucial piece of information about enemy movement patterns, he'd looked right through her, as if she hadn't spoken. The auditorium began filling with attendees as the ceremony approached. Elena could see her parents through a gap in the backstage curtain, her father's chest swelled with pride, her mother dabbing at her eyes. Her unit was there too, the men and women she'd served alongside, who knew exactly what that Silver Star represented. They understood the nights without sleep, the constant danger, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Colonel Sarah Matthews, the base commander, approached Elena backstage. Matthews was a no-nonsense officer who'd earned her position through competence and dedication. She'd fought her own battles against the Old Boys Network and had nothing but respect for soldiers like Elena who proved themselves through action rather than politics. "You ready for this, Rodriguez?" Matthews asked, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine respect. "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. She'd faced enemy fire without flinching, but the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people while someone read her accomplishments aloud made her uncomfortable. "You've earned this," Matthews continued. "Every word in that citation, every moment of recognition. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The colonel's words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Both women understood the challenges facing female soldiers in a male-dominated military structure. Elena had worked twice as hard as her male counterparts to prove herself, had endured comments and assumptions that would have broken lesser people. The Silver Star wasn't just recognition of her heroism. It was validation of her place among the military's elite. As the ceremony began, Elena took her place in line with the other recipients. The auditorium fell silent as the color guard presented the flag and the national anthem played. The solemnity of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. These weren't just pieces of metal being handed out. They were symbols of sacrifice, courage, and dedication to something greater than oneself. General Thornfield took the podium to deliver the opening remarks. His speech was polished and rehearsed, filled with the standard talking points about service and sacrifice. But Elena detected something in his tone, a subtle condescension when he mentioned the diversity of today's recipients. It was the kind of comment that could be interpreted as inclusive while carrying undertones that suggested some recipients were more deserving than others. The first awards were presented without incident. Each recipient stepped forward, saluted, received their recognition, and returned to position. The audience applauded appropriately, cameras flashed, and proud families captured moments they'd treasure forever. Elena watched it all while mentally preparing for her own moment in the spotlight. When her name was called, Elena stepped forward with the crisp precision of a seasoned professional. Her movements were economical, purposeful, betraying none of the nervous energy she felt inside. The citation was read aloud, each word carefully chosen to honor her actions while protecting operational security. The audience listened with respectful attention, understanding that they were hearing about genuine heroism. But as Elena stood at attention in front of General Thornfield, something in his expression shifted. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in her appearance, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Perhaps he recognized her from their previous encounter, or perhaps he simply couldn't reconcile the image of this young woman with the actions described in the citation. The Silver Star gleamed in the stage lights as Thornfield held it up for the audience to see. It was a beautiful piece, a bronze star suspended from a red, white, and blue ribbon, simple in design but profound in meaning. Elena had seen others receive this medal, had always wondered what it would feel like to earn such recognition. Now, standing on the verge of that moment, she felt the weight of all the sacrifices that had led her here. But instead of pinning the medal to her uniform as protocol dictated, General Thornfield hesitated. His eyes moved from the medal to Elena's face, then back to the medal. The pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough for people in the audience to shift in their seats and wonder what was happening. "This is quite an honor, Sergeant," Thornfield said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I trust you understand the significance of what you're receiving." Elena's training kicked in automatically. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the confusion building in her chest. The general's tone suggested something was amiss, though she couldn't identify what. Thornfield continued to hold the medal, making no move to pin it to her uniform. "Such decorations are reserved for our finest warriors," he said, his emphasis on the word warriors unmistakable. "Those who've proven themselves in the crucible of combat." The word stung because of their implication. Elena had proven herself in that crucible, had faced death and dealt it in return, had carried the burden of taking lives to protect others. But Thornfield's tone suggested he doubted her worthiness, questioned whether someone who looked like her could possibly have earned such recognition. Colonel Matthews, standing to the side of the stage, shifted uncomfortably. She could see the direction this was heading and didn't like it one bit. The audience, initially respectful and attentive, was beginning to sense that something was wrong. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Elena's parents, sitting in the third row, exchanged worried glances. Her father, a veteran himself, recognized the dynamics at play. He'd seen similar situations during his own service, had watched qualified soldiers face doubt and dismissal based on appearances rather than actions. His hands clenched in his lap as he fought the urge to stand up and defend his daughter. Back on stage, the tension continued to build. General Thornfield seemed to be wrestling with some internal debate, his eyes moving between Elena's face and the medal in his hands. The pause had gone on far too long, crossing the line from ceremony to spectacle. "Sir," Elena prompted quietly, hoping to move the process forward. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could sense the confusion and discomfort spreading through the audience. Thornfield's expression hardened, and he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of pinning the medal to Elena's uniform, he tucked it into his own pocket. "I think there's been some mistake," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "This level of decoration requires verification. We can't simply hand out our highest honors without proper confirmation." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. In front of her parents, her unit, her peers, and hundreds of strangers, this general was questioning her worthiness to receive an award that had already been thoroughly vetted and approved through multiple levels of command. The humiliation was complete and devastating. But if General Thornfield expected Elena to cower or break down, he had seriously miscalculated. The woman standing before him had been forged in fires he'd never faced, had survived situations that would have broken lesser people. Being embarrassed in front of an audience was nothing compared to what she'd already endured. Elena's voice, when she spoke, was steady as steel. "Sir, with respect, that medal was earned. Every word in that citation is accurate and verified." Thornfield's eyebrows rose at her response. In his world, junior officers didn't question senior leadership, especially not in public. "Sergeant, I think you're forgetting your place." "No, sir," Elena replied, her voice gaining strength. "I know exactly where I belong. The question is whether you do." The auditorium had fallen completely silent now. This was no longer a ceremony. It was a confrontation, a moment that would define careers and reputations. Every person in that room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years to come. Colonel Matthews stepped forward, recognizing that the situation was spiraling out of control. "General Thornfield, perhaps we should discuss this privately after the ceremony." But Thornfield was committed to his course of action now. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down in front of so many witnesses. "This is my decision to make, Colonel. I won't be party to diminishing the value of our military decorations." Elena felt something shift inside her, a cold anger that she'd learned to control and channel during her years in special operations. This wasn't about military protocol or proper verification. This was about a man who couldn't accept that someone who looked like her could be worthy of recognition he probably didn't deserve himself. "General," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "you have something that belongs to me." The words were simple, but they carried undercurrents of meaning that made several people in the audience sit up straighter. There was something in Elena's tone, in her posture, that suggested she was far more dangerous than she appeared. Thornfield seemed to sense it too, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "What belongs to you, Sergeant, is respect for the chain of command and proper military bearing." Elena took a step closer to the general, close enough that her next words wouldn't carry beyond the stage. But the microphone picked up her response anyway, broadcasting it to the entire auditorium. "What belongs to me is that medal, and the respect that comes with earning it. You can question my appearance, my gender, or anything else about me, but you cannot question what I've done to earn that recognition." The general's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. This was not how his morning was supposed to go. He'd expected a simple ceremony, some photos for the base newsletter, and a return to his regular duties. Instead, he found himself in a public confrontation with a soldier who clearly wasn't intimidated by his rank. "You're out of line, Sergeant," he growled, his voice rising. "I could have you brought up on charges for insubordination." Elena's response was calm and measured, but every person in that auditorium could hear the steel beneath the words. "You could try, sir. But I think you'd find that conversation very educational." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elena was telling this general, in front of hundreds of witnesses, that if he wanted to make this a fight, she was ready for whatever he could throw at her. And something in her demeanor suggested she was very good at fighting. Colonel Matthews stepped forward again, recognizing that this confrontation was about to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "General, I strongly recommend we continue this discussion in private. Master Sergeant Rodriguez has an exemplary record, and this medal was approved through proper channels." But Elena wasn't interested in private discussions or behind-closed-doors negotiations. This general had humiliated her in public. The resolution needed to be equally public. "No," she said firmly, surprising both the colonel and the general. "This ends here, now, in front of everyone who witnessed it begin." The auditorium was so quiet now that every breath seemed amplified. Elena's parents gripped each other's hands, terrified for their daughter, but simultaneously proud of her courage. Her unit watched with a mixture of concern and admiration, knowing that Elena was putting her career on the line for a principle. General Thornfield found himself in an impossible position. He'd created this confrontation based on assumptions and prejudices, but now he was face to face with someone who clearly wouldn't be intimidated or dismissed. The smart move would be to retreat, to find some face-saving way to end the standoff. But his pride and his position made retreat feel like surrender. "You want your medal, Sergeant?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Then, convince me you've earned it." It was the wrong thing to say to the wrong person at the wrong time. Elena Rodriguez had spent years proving herself to people who didn't think she belonged, who assumed she was weak or incapable based on her appearance. She'd endured comments, challenges, and dismissals that would have driven most people away from military service entirely. But she'd persevered, had excelled, had earned the right to stand among the military's elite. "You want convincing?" Elena asked, her voice so quiet that the microphone barely picked it up. "Then, let me tell you who you're talking to." What happened next would become legendary in military circles, a moment when quiet professionalism gave way to righteous anger, and a general learned that rank doesn't always determine who holds the real power in a confrontation. Elena's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but to trained eyes in the audience, the change was dramatic. Her shoulders squared, her stance widened slightly, and something predatory entered her gaze. The transformation was subtle yet complete, like watching a house cat reveal itself to be a panther. "My name is Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "For the past 8 years, I've served with the 75th Ranger Regiment and Delta Force. I've completed 17 classified missions across 4 continents. I've been awarded the Bronze Star twice, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Action Badge." General Thornfield's face began to change as Elena spoke. The arrogance was slowly being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like concern. Elena continued, her voice never rising but somehow becoming more commanding with each word. "I speak 4 languages fluently and can kill a man in 12 different ways with my bare hands. I'm qualified on every small arms weapon in the U.S. inventory and several that aren't. I hold a black belt in Krav Maga and a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu." The audience was riveted now. This wasn't the administrative specialist or supply clerk they'd assumed Elena to be. This was something else entirely, something dangerous and highly trained. "The silver star you're holding," Elena said, taking another step closer to the general, "was earned during Operation Desert Thunder in Afghanistan. My team was inserted behind enemy lines to extract a captured CIA operative. The mission went sideways when our insertion point was compromised." Colonel Matthews watched in fascination as Elena recounted details that even she hadn't been fully briefed on. The young sergeant was painting a picture of military operations that few people ever got to see, the shadowy world of special operations where America's most dangerous enemies were neutralized by people who officially didn't exist. "For 3 days, my team moved through hostile territory while being hunted by over 200 enemy fighters," Elena continued. "On the second night, our team leader took shrapnel from a mortar round. Internal bleeding, probable spleen damage, unable to walk. The extraction point was still 12 miles away through mountain terrain." Elena's eyes never left General Thornfield's face as she spoke. She could see the realization dawning in his expression, the understanding that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "I carried Staff Sergeant Murphy for 12 miles while our team fought a running battle with enemy forces. I personally engaged and eliminated 7 hostiles during that movement, including a sniper team that had us pinned down for 3 hours. When we reached the extraction point, Murphy was still alive because I refused to leave him behind." The auditorium was completely silent except for Elena's voice. Her parents sat transfixed, learning details about their daughter's service that they'd never heard before. Her father, despite his own military experience, felt his jaw dropping as he realized the level of operations his little girl had been involved in. "The citation you read mentions extraordinary heroism," Elena said, her voice gaining intensity. "What it doesn't mention is that I made that entire movement with a bullet in my shoulder from the initial contact. What it doesn't mention is that I went back into the kill zone twice to retrieve equipment we needed for communication with the extraction team." General Thornfield's throat felt dry. The metal in his pocket seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Around the auditorium, people were beginning to murmur as the implications of Elena's words sank in. This wasn't just any soldier. This was a member of America's most elite fighting force. "You want to know about warriors, General?" Elena asked, her voice finally showing emotion. "Warriors are the people who volunteer for missions where death is more likely than survival. Warriors are the ones who carry their wounded teammates 12 miles through hell, because leaving them behind isn't an option. Warriors are the ones who put their lives on the line not for glory or recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. Elena was now close enough to General Thornfield that she could speak in a normal voice without the microphone picking up her words. But she made no effort to lower her volume. This conversation was happening in public because that's where it had started. I've killed people, General. Not from a distance with drones or artillery, but up close where I could see their eyes. I've made decisions in the space of heartbeats that determined who lived and who died. I've bled for my country in places that don't appear on any map, fighting enemies whose names you'll never know. The general's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand not just what Elena had done, but what she was capable of. The young woman standing in front of him wasn't someone to be dismissed or underestimated. She was a predator, a weapon honed by years of the most dangerous training the military could provide. So when you suggest that I haven't earned this medal, Elena continued, when you question my worthiness to stand among warriors, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every man and woman who's bled alongside me, who's trusted me to bring them home, who's counted on me when everything went wrong. Colonel Matthews found herself holding her breath. She'd served in combat zones herself, had commanded troops under fire, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. Elena was dismantling General Thornfield's assumptions piece by piece, revealing herself to be exactly the kind of soldier every officer hoped to have under their command. The difference between us, General, Elena said, her voice now carrying the cold precision of someone accustomed to life and death decisions, is that my medals were earned with blood and courage. Yours appear to have been earned with politics and paperwork. It was a devastating accusation, and everyone in the auditorium knew it. General Thornfield's chest was covered with ribbons and badges, but Elena's words suggested that few, if any of them, had been earned in actual combat. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Thornfield finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. Sergeant Rodriguez, you're way out of line. Am I? Elena asked, tilting her head slightly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I'm exactly where I need to be. You took something that belongs to me, something I earned in ways you can't imagine, and now you're going to give it back. The confrontation had moved beyond military protocol into something more primal. This wasn't about rank or chain of command anymore. This was about respect, recognition, and the fundamental question of who had the right to judge another person's worth. Elena's teammates in the audience watched with a mixture of pride and concern. They knew what she was capable of, had seen her in action, had trusted their lives to her judgment and skills. But they also knew that challenging a general like this could end her career, regardless of how justified her actions might be. I could have you court-martialed for insubordination, Thornfield said, though his voice lacked conviction now. I could end your career with a phone call. Elena's smile was cold and predatory. You could try, but I think you'd find that conversation very interesting. You see, General, when you've done the kind of work I've done, when you've served at the level I've served, you develop relationships. Relationships with people who understand the value of quiet professionals who get things done. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elena was suggesting that she had connections that might make Thornfield's life very difficult if he chose to pursue retribution. In the world of special operations, reputation and relationships often mattered more than rank. You think your friends in high places will protect you? Thornfield asked, trying to regain some authority. I don't have friends in high places, Elena replied matter-of-factly. I have brothers and sisters who've bled with me in low places, and they tend to be very protective of each other. Colonel Matthews decided it was time to intervene before the situation escalated beyond any hope of resolution. General Thornfield, Master Sergeant Rodriguez has an exemplary record. Her awards and decorations have been thoroughly vetted and approved through appropriate channels. Perhaps we should proceed with the ceremony as planned. But Elena held up a hand to stop the colonel's intervention. No, ma'am. The general wanted to make this public, so we're going to finish it in public. He questioned my worthiness to receive this medal. I think it's only fair that we examine his worthiness to present it. The auditorium was completely silent now. Elena had just declared war on a general officer in front of hundreds of witnesses. The smart move would be to de-escalate, to find some compromise that allowed both parties to save face. But Elena had been pushed too far to care about smart moves. What are your combat decorations, General? Elena asked, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. How many times have you been in direct contact with enemy forces? When was the last time you fired your weapon in anger? Thornfield's face flushed red again. The questions were devastating because everyone in the auditorium could guess the answers. His career had been built on staff positions and political appointments, not combat leadership. My service record is not on trial here, Sergeant, he said. But the words sounded weak even to his own ears. Isn't it? Elena asked. Because you seem to think you're qualified to judge the worth of combat decorations. I'm just wondering what qualifies you to make that judgment. Elena began walking slowly around the general, her movements controlled and predatory. It was a combat technique designed to keep an opponent off balance and unsure where the next attack might come from. I've read your service record, General. It's publicly available information. Pentagon staff assignments, logistics coordination, budget management. Important work, necessary work, but not the kind of work that gives you the right to question the valor of people who've actually fought America's enemies. Each word was like a knife thrust, precisely placed to cause maximum damage. Elena was systematically destroying Thornfield's credibility and authority in front of an audience that included his own staff officers and subordinates. You've spent your career in air-conditioned offices making decisions about people like me, Elena continued. People who volunteer for the dangerous assignments, who go into harm's way so that others can sleep safely. And now you have the audacity to question whether I've earned the right to be recognized for my service. Thornfield was beginning to realize that he was in a fight he couldn't win. Elena had superior moral authority, superior combat credentials, and superior public relations position. Every word she spoke made him look smaller and more petty. The worst part, Elena said, her voice filled with controlled anger, is that you did this in front of my family. My father served 2 tours in Vietnam. He earned his medals the hard way, in jungles where young men died because politicians made promises they couldn't keep. He flew here to watch his daughter receive recognition for her service, and you tried to take that away from both of us. Elena's parents watched their daughter with a mixture of terror and pride. They'd always known she was tough, had suspected that her military service involved more than she'd told them. But seeing her face down a general officer with such controlled fury revealed depths to their daughter they'd never imagined. So here's what's going to happen, Elena said, stopping directly in front of General Thornfield. You're going to take that medal out of your pocket. You're going to pin it to my uniform where it belongs. You're going to salute me with the respect that any Silver Star recipient deserves. And then you're going to apologize to my family for the disrespect you've shown. The demands were simple but devastating. Elena was forcing Thornfield to choose between his pride and his career. If he complied, he would be publicly humiliated. If he refused, he would face the consequences of challenging someone who clearly had resources he didn't fully understand. Thornfield looked around the auditorium desperately, seeking some escape from the trap he'd created for himself. But every face he saw reflected the same judgment. He'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong person at the wrong time. And if I refuse? He asked, though he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then, we'll have a very interesting conversation about professional competence and fitness for command. Because anyone who can't recognize a warrior when they're standing right in front of them probably shouldn't be in a position to make decisions about warriors. The threat was clear and devastating. Elena was suggesting that she would use this incident to challenge Thornfield's fitness for command, potentially ending his career just as surely as he'd threatened to end hers. Colonel Matthews watched the confrontation with professional fascination. She'd never seen someone dismantle a superior officer so completely and systematically. Elena was fighting with weapons that Thornfield didn't even know existed: reputation, respect, and the unbreakable bonds forged in combat. The silence stretched on as General Thornfield wrestled with his impossible situation. Around the auditorium, whispers had begun to ripple through the crowd as people processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a disagreement between 2 soldiers. It was a fundamental challenge to the assumptions about power, authority, and respect that governed military hierarchy. Elena stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on Thornfield's face, waiting for his decision. Her stillness wasn't passive. It was the controlled patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. Every second of hesitation on the general's part only emphasized his weakness and her strength. Staff officers in Thornfield's entourage shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could see their superior being systematically dismantled by someone they'd probably dismissed as irrelevant when they'd arrived that morning. The power dynamics in the room had shifted so completely that several of them were questioning their own associations with the general. Elena's father, sitting in the third row, felt his chest swell with a complicated mixture of emotions. Pride at his daughter's courage was mixed with fear for her future and amazement at the woman she'd become. He'd known she was tough, had raised her to stand up for herself, but this level of controlled fury and tactical thinking was beyond anything he'd imagined. You know what the real problem is here, General? Elena asked, breaking the silence. You looked at me and saw someone you thought you could push around. Someone who wouldn't fight back, who'd accept whatever you decided to dish out. You saw a woman and assumed weakness. Thornfield's jaw tightened at the accusation, but he couldn't deny its truth. His assumptions about Elena had been based entirely on her appearance, her gender, and his own preconceptions about who belonged among the military's elite. That kind of thinking gets people killed in the field, Elena continued. When you underestimate your enemy because of how they look, when you assume superiority based on appearances, you create the conditions for catastrophic failure. And that's exactly what you've done here today. Colonel Matthews found herself taking notes, not literally, but mentally. This was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and Elena was conducting it with the precision of someone who'd been trained by the very best. Every word was chosen for maximum effect, every pause calculated to increase pressure. I've served with women who could outshoot, outfight, and outthink most of the men in their units, Elena said. I've seen female medics run into gunfire to save wounded soldiers. I've watched women pilots bring damaged aircraft home when male pilots would have ejected. But you wouldn't know any of that because you've never been in those situations. Elena began moving again, circling Thornfield with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to combat movement. Her positioning forced him to turn to keep her in sight, disrupting his balance and keeping him off guard. The military is changing, General. It's becoming more diverse, more inclusive, more willing to recognize talent regardless of where it comes from. But, apparently, you didn't get that memo. You're still operating under the old assumptions, the ones that say leadership and courage can only come in one package. Elena's words carried beyond the immediate confrontation to address broader issues within the military culture. Everyone in the auditorium understood that this moment was about more than just one medal ceremony. It was about the future direction of military leadership and values. I've served under commanders who judged their people by performance, not appearance, Elena continued. Leaders who understood that the best weapon systems are useless without operators who are willing to risk everything to complete the mission. Those commanders knew that courage and competence come in all forms, and they built their units accordingly. Thornfield was beginning to sweat despite the auditorium's air conditioning. He could feel the judgment of everyone present, could sense that his authority was evaporating with each passing moment. The smart move would be to capitulate, to find some way to end this confrontation before it completely destroyed his reputation. But pride and decades of unchallenged authority made it difficult for him to accept defeat, especially at the hands of someone he'd so thoroughly underestimated. Perhaps I was hasty, he said finally, the words coming out reluctantly. Maybe we should reconsider the presentation. Elena shook her head slowly. No, General. You weren't hasty. You were revealing your true character. And now that we've all seen it, we can't unsee it. The condemnation was absolute and devastating. Elena wasn't offering Thornfield an easy way out, a face-saving compromise that would allow him to retreat with dignity intact. She was demanding a complete and public acknowledgement of his error. You question my worthiness to receive this medal, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. You did it in front of my family, my peers, and my superiors. You suggested that I hadn't earned the right to be recognized for my service. That kind of disrespect requires more than a quiet reconsideration. Elena stopped directly in front of Thornfield again, close enough that their conversation couldn't be misunderstood as anything other than a direct confrontation. The physical positioning emphasized the power shift that had occurred. She was now the one controlling the interaction. I want you to understand something, Elena said, her voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow seemed more threatening than shouting would have been. This medal represents 3 days in hell that you can't imagine. It represents decisions that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It represents the trust of teammates who knew I'd bring them home no matter what the cost. Elena's voice remained steady, but emotion began to creep into her words. Not weakness or vulnerability, but the controlled passion of someone defending something sacred. When you tried to take this medal from me, you weren't just questioning my achievements. You were questioning the sacrifice of every person who's ever served in harm's way. You were suggesting that their recognition isn't safe from the whims of people who've never faced the same risks. The audience was completely absorbed now. Elena had transformed what could have been a simple confrontation into something deeper, a defense of military values and recognition that resonated with every veteran and service member present. I've lost friends in combat, General. Good people who died doing their jobs, who never got the chance to receive the recognition they'd earned. Their families treasure the medals and citations they received posthumously because those pieces of metal are all they have left of their loved one's service. Elena's words painted a picture of sacrifice that made Thornfield's actions seem even more petty and insulting. She was connecting her personal situation to the broader sacrifice made by all military personnel and their families. When you casually dismiss the value of military decorations, when you suggest they can be withheld based on your personal prejudices, you dishonor every person who's ever worn this uniform. And that's something I won't tolerate, regardless of the consequences. Colonel Matthews realized she was witnessing something historic. This wasn't just a confrontation between two soldiers. It was a defining moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Elena was articulating principles that many people felt, but few had the courage to voice so directly. So here's your choice, Elena said, extending her hand toward Thornfield. Give me my medal, apologize for your disrespectful behavior, and we can all move forward. Or continue this path and discover just how many people are willing to support someone who's actually earned their position through merit rather than politics. The ultimatum was clear and uncompromising. Thornfield could capitulate and suffer the humiliation of a public defeat, or he could escalate and face the consequences of challenging someone with resources and connections he clearly didn't fully understand. Around the auditorium, people were beginning to shift in their seats. The tension had become almost unbearable, and everyone understood that whatever happened next would have far-reaching consequences for all involved. Elena's teammates exchanged glances, silently communicating their readiness to support her regardless of what came next. These were people who'd trusted their lives to her judgment and had never been disappointed. They weren't about to abandon her now. Thornfield looked around desperately, seeking some escape from the trap he'd created. But every face he saw reflected the same judgment. He'd made a catastrophic error in picking this fight, and his only option was to find the least damaging way to surrender. The medal, Elena said simply, her hand still extended. It belongs to me, and you're going to return it. The only question is whether you do it with grace or we continue this conversation until everyone in this auditorium understands exactly who they're looking at. Elena's confidence was absolute and unshakable. She'd faced down armed enemies in life-or-death situations. One arrogant general in a controlled environment wasn't going to intimidate her. If anything, his behavior had awakened the controlled fury that had made her so effective in special operations. You have 5 seconds to make your decision, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in critical situations. After that, we move to the next phase of this conversation, and I promise you won't like where that leads. The countdown was psychological warfare at its most effective. By imposing a deadline, Elena was forcing Thornfield to act rather than continuing to hesitate and deliberate. Every second of delay only emphasized his weakness and indecision. 5, Elena said, her voice as steady as a metronome. Thornfield's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, but he was beginning to realize that his options were rapidly diminishing. 4. Around the auditorium, people held their breath. Everyone understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment, a confrontation that would be remembered long after the participants had moved on to other assignments. 3. Elena's teammates tensed, ready to support whatever action she decided to take. They knew her well enough to understand that she never made threats she wasn't prepared to follow through on. 2. Thornfield's hand moved toward his pocket where the medal waited. His movement was reluctant, defeated, but it was movement nonetheless. 1. General Thornfield pulled the silver star from his pocket, his hand trembling slightly with suppressed rage and humiliation. The medal caught the auditorium lights, its bronze star gleaming against the red, white, and blue ribbon. Elena stood perfectly still, her hand still extended, waiting for him to complete the action. She wasn't going to make it easy for him, wasn't going to allow him to minimize the moment or rush through it without acknowledging what was happening. Pin it to my uniform, Elena said quietly, where it belongs. General Thornfield's hands shook slightly as he reached toward Elena's uniform with the silver star. The simple act of pinning a medal had become a public acknowledgement of his complete and utter defeat. Every person in the auditorium watched as he was forced to perform the very ceremony he'd tried to deny her. Elena stood at perfect attention, her posture rigid and professional despite the personal nature of the confrontation. She wasn't going to give Thornfield or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her gloat or lose composure. This moment was about honor and respect, and she would conduct herself accordingly. As the general's fingers fumbled with the pin, Elena spoke quietly enough that only he could hear her words, though the microphone picked up just enough for the audience to sense that additional communication was taking place. This is what respect looks like, General. Remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance rather than their achievements. Thornfield's jaw clenched as he finally managed to secure the medal to Elena's uniform. The silver star hung exactly where it belonged, over her heart, catching the stage lights and seeming to glow with its own internal fire. Now the salute, Elena said, stepping back to the appropriate distance for the formal conclusion of the medal ceremony. Thornfield's salute was crisp and correct, though everyone present could see the effort it required. This wasn't the casual acknowledgement of routine military courtesy. This was a defeated superior officer being forced to show respect to someone who had completely outmaneuvered him. Elena returned the salute with precision that spoke to years of military training and discipline. But there was something else in her bearing now, a quiet satisfaction that came from standing up for her principles and emerging victorious. "Thank you, General," Elena said formally, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "I accept this recognition on behalf of all the men and women who've served alongside me in harm's way." The gracious words only emphasized Thornfield's petty behavior by contrast. While he had tried to diminish her achievement, Elena was using her moment of triumph to honor her fellow soldiers. The audience erupted in applause that started scattered and uncertain but quickly built into a thunderous ovation. People throughout the auditorium rose to their feet, recognizing that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just applause for Elena's medal. It was recognition of her courage in standing up for herself and her principles. Elena's parents were among the first to stand. Her father's chest swelled with pride, while her mother wept openly. They'd watched their daughter face down a general officer and emerge victorious through nothing but determination and righteous anger. Her teammates applauded with the controlled enthusiasm of professional soldiers who'd just watched one of their own achieve something remarkable. They understood better than anyone else what this confrontation had required, both in terms of courage and tactical thinking. Colonel Matthews joined the standing ovation with obvious relief and admiration. She'd been prepared to intervene if the situation had escalated beyond Elena's ability to control, but it had become clear that intervention wasn't necessary. Elena had handled the situation with a level of skill that impressive even experienced officers. As the applause continued, Elena maintained her military bearing while acknowledging the recognition with small nods and a slight smile. She understood that the audience wasn't just celebrating her medal, they were showing support for her willingness to stand up against injustice. General Thornfield stood awkwardly on the stage, unsure whether to remain or retreat. His staff officers avoided making eye contact, clearly embarrassed by their superior's behavior and its consequences. The power dynamics that had governed the morning had been completely reversed, leaving everyone to navigate new realities. When the applause finally began to die down, Elena stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady and professional as she addressed the audience directly. "Thank you all for your support. This medal represents the collective efforts of my entire team, and I share this recognition with every person who's served alongside me. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it home to receive recognition, and we honor their memory by continuing to serve with dedication and courage." Elena's words shifted the focus away from the confrontation and back to the broader purpose of the ceremony. She was demonstrating the kind of leadership and grace under pressure that made her worthy of the decoration she'd just received. "Military service requires sacrifice from all of us," Elena continued. "But it also requires us to support each other and recognize excellence wherever we find it. Today's ceremony reminds us that courage comes in many forms, and we must be ready to acknowledge and honor it regardless of our preconceptions." The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Elena was calling for a more inclusive and merit-based approach to military leadership, using her moment in the spotlight to advocate for broader changes in military culture. As Elena stepped back from the microphone, The ceremony continued with the remaining award presentations. But everyone understood that the morning had been fundamentally altered by what they'd witnessed. The other recipients received their recognition to enthusiastic applause, but the energy in the room had been permanently changed. After the formal ceremony concluded, Elena was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Fellow soldiers, family members, and even some of Thornfield's own staff officers approached her to offer congratulations and express their admiration for her handling of the situation. Elena accepted the praise graciously while maintaining her professional demeanor. She understood that her actions would be analyzed and discussed for years to come, and she wanted to ensure that her behavior reflected well on the principles she defended. Colonel Matthews approached Elena as the crowd around her began to thin. "That was quite a performance, Master Sergeant," she said with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You handled yourself with remarkable composure under very trying circumstances." "Thank you, ma'am," Elena replied. "I hope I represented my unit and my service appropriately." "More than appropriately," Matthews said. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and character that our military needs. But you should be aware that this incident will have consequences, both positive and negative." Elena nodded her understanding. She'd known from the moment she'd chosen to confront Thornfield that her actions would have far-reaching implications. But some principles were worth the risk. "General Thornfield has already requested a private meeting with me," Matthews continued. "I suspect he's looking for some way to minimize the fallout from this morning. How would you like me to handle that conversation?" Elena considered the question carefully. She'd achieved her immediate objective of receiving the recognition she'd earned, but the broader issues that had led to the confrontation remained unresolved. "Ma'am, I think it's important that this incident be properly documented and investigated, not for purposes of retribution, but to ensure that other soldiers don't face similar treatment in the future." Matthews smiled at Elena's response. Even in victory, she was thinking about the welfare of her fellow soldiers rather than personal gain or revenge. "I'll make sure that happens," Matthews promised. "Your actions today have opened a conversation that was long overdue." As Elena finally made her way toward her family, she reflected on the morning's events. The confrontation with Thornfield had been unplanned and unwanted, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes standing up for principles required accepting risks that more cautious people would avoid. Her father embraced her with tears in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mija," he said, using the childhood nickname that transported her back to simpler times. "You stood up for yourself and for everyone who's ever worn the uniform." Her mother's embrace was equally emotional. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I was also amazed. You handled yourself like a true leader." Elena's teammates gathered around her family, creating an informal receiving line of people who wanted to express their admiration and support. These were the people whose opinions mattered most to her, the men and women who'd served alongside her and understood the true cost of military service. As the group prepared to leave the auditorium, Elena caught sight of General Thornfield speaking quietly with his staff officers near the stage. He looked older somehow, diminished by the morning's events. She felt no satisfaction in his obvious distress, only sadness that the confrontation had been necessary. Staff Sergeant Martinez, one of Elena's closest teammates, approached her as they walked toward the exit. "That was something else," he said quietly. "I've never seen anyone take apart a general officer like that." "It wasn't about taking him apart," Elena replied. "It was about standing up for what's right. Anyone in my position should have done the same thing." Martinez shook his head. "Not everyone would have had the courage to do what you did. Most people would have accepted the disrespect and tried to handle it through official channels later." Elena understood his point, but she also knew that official channels often failed to address fundamental problems with military culture. Sometimes direct action was the only way to create meaningful change. As they reached the auditorium lobby, Elena was approached by a young female soldier she didn't recognize. The woman appeared nervous but determined as she stepped forward. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," the young soldier said, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did in there. I'm a new lieutenant, and I've already faced some of the attitudes you confronted today. Seeing you stand up for yourself gives me hope that things can change." Elena smiled warmly at the young officer. "They will change, Lieutenant, but only if we're all willing to demand better. Your generation of leaders will make the difference." The conversation continued as more people approached Elena, each with their own story of facing similar challenges or witnessing unfair treatment. The morning's events had clearly resonated with a broad cross-section of military personnel who'd experienced or observed the kind of behavior Thornfield had displayed. Outside the auditorium, Elena's family gathered for photos with her medal prominently displayed. The silver star caught the sunlight, its bronze finish gleaming against her dress blue uniform. But, more than the medal itself, Elena's expression conveyed the satisfaction of someone who'd stood up for her principles and emerged victorious. As the photo session concluded, Elena reflected on the broader implications of the morning's events. The confrontation with Thornfield had been about more than just one medal or one moment of disrespect. It had been about the fundamental question of who belonged among the military's elite and who had the authority to make that determination. The answer, she realized, was that belonging was earned through service, sacrifice, and commitment to something greater than oneself. No amount of rank or political positioning could substitute for the kind of credibility that came from facing danger and accepting responsibility for the welfare of others. As her family prepared to leave Fort Braxton, Elena took one last look at the auditorium where the ceremony had taken place. The building looked ordinary enough from the outside, but she knew that what had happened inside that morning would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The confrontation with General Thornfield had been unpleasant and stressful, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes changing institutional culture required dramatic moments that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about their assumptions and prejudices. Elena climbed into her family's car for the drive to the celebratory lunch they'd planned, her silver star still gleaming on her uniform. She'd earned this recognition through courage and sacrifice in combat, but she'd also earned something else that morning: the respect of everyone who'd witnessed her willingness to stand up for her principles regardless of the consequences. The day that had started with a simple medal ceremony had become something much more significant. It had become a moment when one soldier's courage had challenged an entire system and demonstrated that real authority came not from rank or position, but from character and conviction. 3 months after the medal ceremony, the ripple effects of Elena's confrontation with General Thornfield continued to spread throughout the military establishment. What had begun as a single moment of defiance had evolved into a broader conversation about leadership, merit, and the changing face of modern military service. Elena sat in Colonel Matthews' office, reviewing the final report of the investigation that had been launched following the incident. The document was thorough and damning, detailing a pattern of behavior by General Thornfield that extended far beyond his treatment of Elena. Multiple soldiers had come forward with similar stories of discrimination and disrespect. "The Inspector General's report makes for interesting reading," Matthews said, sliding a copy across her desk. "It seems your confrontation gave other people the courage to speak up about their own experiences." Elena scanned the executive summary, noting the careful language that military bureaucrats use to describe serious misconduct. Terms like failure to maintain appropriate standards and inconsistent with military values translated into a scathing indictment of Thornfield's leadership style. "What happens now?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "General Thornfield has announced his retirement, effective immediately," Matthews replied. "Officially, it's for personal reasons and to spend more time with his family. Unofficially, he was given the choice between retiring gracefully or facing a formal court-martial." Elena felt no satisfaction in Thornfield's downfall. She'd never wanted to destroy his career. She'd simply wanted the respect and recognition she'd earned. But she understood that sometimes individual confrontations revealed broader systemic problems that required dramatic solutions. "There's more," Matthews continued. "The incident has caught the attention of people much higher up the chain of command. The Secretary of Defense has ordered a comprehensive review of military promotion and recognition procedures. Your name has been mentioned as someone who might serve on the review committee." Elena leaned back in her chair, processing the implications of what the colonel was telling her. The confrontation that had started as a personal matter was now influencing policy at the highest levels of government. "That's quite an honor," Elena said finally. "But I hope the focus remains on creating better systems rather than highlighting individual cases." Matthews smiled at Elena's response. Even when offered recognition and advancement, she remained focused on the broader good rather than personal benefit. "Speaking of advancement," Matthews continued, "there's been some discussion about your future assignments. Several senior commanders have requested you for their staffs. Word has gotten around about your performance, both in combat and in standing up for military values." Elena had been expecting this conversation. The incident with Thornfield had raised her profile considerably, bringing both opportunities and challenges. While she appreciated the recognition, she was wary of becoming a symbol rather than simply being allowed to do her job. "What kind of assignments?" she asked. "Training command, mostly. Several people think you'd be excellent at developing the next generation of special operations personnel. There's also interest in having you involved in leadership development programs." Elena considered the options carefully. Training assignments would allow her to influence military culture in meaningful ways, but they would also take her away from the operational roles where she felt most effective. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. But you should know that turning down these opportunities might mean fewer advancement possibilities down the road. The military likes to promote people who are willing to take on high-visibility assignments." Elena understood the implicit message. The confrontation with Thornfield had made her a valuable commodity in the military's ongoing efforts to address issues of diversity and inclusion. But she was determined not to let herself be pigeonholed into a role that limited her effectiveness or reduced her to a token. After leaving Matthew's office, Elena walked across the base toward the training facilities where her unit was conducting exercises. The familiar sounds of military activity, vehicles moving, weapons firing, people calling out orders, provided a comforting backdrop for her thoughts. She found her team preparing for a night infiltration exercise, their equipment spread across several tables as they conducted final inspections and briefings. These were the people she trusted most, the men and women who'd served alongside her in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Sergeant Martinez looked up as she approached. "How did it go with the colonel?" he asked. "Interesting," Elena replied, settling into a chair nearby. "Apparently, our little incident has created some opportunities." She briefed the team on her conversation with Matthews, watching their reactions as she described the various options being presented to her. Their opinions mattered to her more than the recommendations of senior officers she'd never served with. "Training command could be good," suggested Staff Sergeant Williams. "You'd have a chance to influence how things are done from the ground up. Or it could be a way to sideline you," countered Martinez. "Make you someone else's problem while they claim credit for being progressive." Elena appreciated the different perspectives. Her teammates understood both the opportunities and the risks associated with high-profile assignments. They'd seen other talented soldiers get lost in bureaucratic roles that limited their effectiveness. "What do you want to do?" asked Specialist Johnson, the youngest member of the team. Elena considered the question carefully. What she wanted was to continue serving effectively, to make a difference in ways that mattered. Whether that happened in training command or operational units was less important than ensuring she remained true to her principles. "I want to do whatever helps the most people," she said finally. "If that means training new soldiers, fine. If it means staying operational, that's fine too." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a vehicle carrying visitors to the training area. Elena was surprised to see Colonel Matthews emerge from the passenger seat, followed by two men in civilian clothes who had the bearing of senior officials. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Matthews called out, approaching the group. "I'd like you to meet some people who've been following your situation with great interest." The introductions that followed revealed the visitors to be representatives from the Pentagon's Personnel and Readiness Office, the department responsible for military human resources policy. They'd driven down from Washington specifically to meet with Elena and discuss her potential role in upcoming reforms. "We've read the reports about your confrontation with General Thornfield," said Dr. Robert Chun, the senior civilian official. "Your handling of that situation demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership thinking we need to incorporate into our professional development programs." Elena listened politely as Chun described various initiatives being considered at the departmental level. The language was bureaucratic and filled with buzzwords, but the underlying message was clear. They wanted to use her experience to support broader changes in military culture. "We're particularly interested in your thoughts on merit-based evaluation systems," added the second official, a retired colonel named Harrison. "Your situation highlighted some significant flaws in how we assess and recognize performance." Elena appreciated their interest, but she was also wary of becoming a poster child for reform efforts that might not produce meaningful change. She'd seen too many well-intentioned initiatives fail because they focused on appearances rather than substance. "I'm willing to help," she said carefully, "but I think any reforms need to come from operational commanders rather than staff officers. The people making decisions about promotions and assignments need to understand what actually constitutes effective performance." Chun nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly the kind of insight we need." Would you be willing to participate in a series of working groups that are developing new evaluation criteria? Elena agreed to consider their request, but she made it clear that her participation would depend on the scope and structure of the working groups. She wasn't interested in token involvement that allowed officials to claim diversity without actually changing anything meaningful. After the visitors departed, Elena's team resumed their preparation for the night exercise. But the conversation with the Pentagon officials had highlighted the broader implications of her confrontation with Thornfield. What had started as a personal stand for recognition had become part of a larger movement toward institutional change. As darkness fell, and the team began their infiltration exercise, Elena found herself thinking about the young lieutenant who'd approached her after the medal ceremony. That woman, along with countless others like her, represented the future of military service. The changes being discussed in Washington would ultimately affect their careers and opportunities. The exercise proceeded smoothly, with Elena's team demonstrating the kind of professional competence that had made her so effective throughout her career. But as they moved through the simulated enemy territory, she couldn't help but reflect on how different military service was becoming. When she'd first enlisted, opportunities for women in combat roles were limited and often controversial. Now, female soldiers served in special operations units, flew combat aircraft, and commanded at the highest levels. The changes hadn't been easy or universally accepted, but they'd been necessary for the military to remain effective in an evolving world. Her confrontation with General Thornfield was part of that ongoing evolution. By refusing to accept disrespectful treatment, she'd forced a conversation about merit, recognition, and the changing nature of military leadership. The consequences were still unfolding, but the direction seemed positive. 3 weeks later, Elena received official notification of her next assignment. Instead of training command or a staff position, she'd been selected for promotion to sergeant major and assignment to a newly created special operations unit focused on counterterrorism operations in Africa. The assignment was exactly what she'd hoped for: operational responsibility that would allow her to continue serving at the highest levels while avoiding the bureaucratic roles that might have limited her effectiveness. It was also recognition that her confrontation with Thornfield hadn't damaged her career prospects. Colonel Matthews delivered the news personally, along with congratulations and a warning about the challenges ahead. "This unit will be operating in some very difficult environments," she said. "But the command structure is completely supportive of merit-based leadership. They specifically requested you because of your operational record, not because of any political considerations." Elena felt a sense of satisfaction at the news. The assignment represented everything she'd worked toward throughout her career: increased responsibility, challenging missions, and the opportunity to lead at the highest levels of military service. As she prepared for the transition to her new unit, Elena reflected on the events that had brought her to this point. The medal ceremony that had started everything seemed like a lifetime ago, but its lessons remained relevant. Standing up for principles sometimes required accepting significant risks, but it could also create opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The Silver Star still occupied a prominent place in her personal effects, but it had been joined by other decorations earned through subsequent service. More importantly, it had been joined by the respect and recognition of colleagues who valued her contributions regardless of her appearance or background. Elena's story had become part of military lore, told and retold in leadership courses and professional development programs. But she preferred to focus on the future rather than dwelling on past confrontations. There was still work to be done, missions to complete, and soldiers to lead. On her final day at Fort Braxton, Elena walked through the auditorium where she'd confronted General Thornfield. The space looked ordinary in the afternoon light, giving no hint of the dramatic events that had unfolded there months earlier. But she knew that what had happened in that room had changed things in ways that would continue to ripple through the military for years to come. Her legacy wouldn't be the confrontation itself, but the broader changes it had helped catalyze. Future soldiers would benefit from improved evaluation systems, more inclusive leadership development programs, and a culture that valued merit over appearances. As Elena packed her belongings for the move to her new assignment, she found herself thinking about the young soldiers who would follow in her footsteps. They would face their own challenges and confrontations, but they would do so in a military that had learned important lessons about respect, recognition, and the changing nature of service. The general who had tried to take her medal was now a footnote in military history, remembered primarily for his failure to recognize excellence when it stood directly in front of him. Elena, meanwhile, was moving forward to new challenges and opportunities, her career strengthened rather than damaged by her willingness to stand up for her principles. The moral of her story wasn't that confrontation was always the answer, but that some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. In a profession built on honor, courage, and commitment, those values had to be upheld by individuals willing to accept the risks that came with doing what was right.